The blood had not yet dried on the parapet ledger when I was ordered to record the execution as structural maintenance. I stood at the eastern embrasure of Bastion Auric, 40 meters above the churned earth of what had once been the Helios Gate commercial district, and I held the Logister stylus the way I had been taught, level, firm, without the slightest tremor. Below me, 2 serfs were already mixing the reinforcement slurry. The body of the guardsman lay face down on the rampart walkway, arms still bound behind his back with consecrated wire. The spreading pool beneath his shattered skull caught the amber light of the distant firestorms and turned it into something almost beautiful. I did not look at his face. I had never learned his name. The siege ledger did not require names for entries classified under structural correction. Sergeant Aldrin of the 5th Company had performed the execution with a combat blade rather than a bolt pistol. The reasoning was ammunition conservation, though I suspected there was liturgical preference involved. The Catechism of Holding had been recited in full, all 9 stanzas, and the guardsman had knelt without resistance during every verse. He had attempted to retreat from Breach 17 during the previous bombardment cycle. He had survived the breach. He had not survived the doctrine. I inscribed the entry with care. Structural instability removed. Reinforcement material allocated to Section 9 East. Load recalculation pending. The Tech Marine arrived before the blood had begun to congeal. His name was Brother Geddon, and he moved with the mechanical patience that defined every member of the 5th Company's support cadre. He did not speak to me. He examined the rampart surface, ran a gauntlet finger along a hairline fracture in the ferocrete, and then issued his order to the slurry team in a voice stripped of everything except acoustic precision. Incorporate the remains into the next pour. Calciumite enrichment for subsection binders. Standard ratio. I watched the serfs work. They were efficient. They had done this before, many times, during the 3 months since the Helios Gate siege had begun, and their movements carried the fluid economy of practiced repetition. The guardsman's body was dismembered with industrial shears. The bones separated and fed into the calcium processor. The soft tissue rendered and mixed with the tight binding compound. Within the hour, the remains would be indistinguishable from every other component of the wall. Nothing placed within the wall would ever be removed. I understood this. I had been taught this since my induction into chapter service 17 years ago, when the Fortress Monastery's doctrine masters had explained the sacred geometry of Imperial Fists engineering. A wall was not a barrier. A wall was a statement. Every stone laid, every pour of ferocrete, every bolt and bracket and buttress was an argument against entropy, against cowardice, against the fundamental weakness of yielding. The wall did not protect what stood behind it. The wall declared that what stood behind it refused to move. I believed this completely. In those early hours of that 7th day, standing on the rampart with the stylus cooling in my grip and the distant percussion of the siege guns measuring time in concussive intervals, I believed it with the absolute conviction of a man who had never been asked to question the geometry of his faith. But what if that conviction was about to be tested in ways I could never imagine? The 7th day of Wallast was a liturgical observance specific to siege operations. For 6 days, the companies performed continuous fortification rotations, reinforcing, measuring, correcting, sealing. On the 7th day, the chaplain conducted the rite of permanence, blessing the week's construction with oils pressed from the seeds of Inwit's thorn forests, reciting the names of every brother who had died in wall defense since the founding of the chapter. The recitation took 11 hours. I had been present for every one of them during this siege, recording the names as they were spoken, cross-referencing them against the Fortress Logister's master casualty archive. 11 hours of names. Thousands upon thousands. Every single one of them a brother who had chosen the wall over retreat, the position over survival, the geometry of defiance over the animal impulse to flee. I found it beautiful. Yet deep beneath that beauty, something silent and unseen was already beginning to crack. The siege had reduced the hive city of Veriman's Reach to a series of concentric fortification rings. each one marking a stage of controlled withdrawal that the Imperial Fists would never have described as withdrawal. The outer districts were gone, pulverized into gray rubble that the enemy used as approach cover. The middle districts had been systematically demolished by the Fists themselves, their materials repurposed for the inner bastion's reinforcement. The inner bastion, where I worked and prayed and slept my rationed 4 hours per cycle, was a dense lattice of firing positions, kill zones, supply corridors, and chapels. It was a fortress built inside the corpse of a city, and it functioned with the pitiless clarity of a machine. I served as serf architect, a designation that combined the duties of structural surveyor, load analyst, and administrative recorder. My tools were the theodolite, the caliper, the compression gauge, and the logister stylus. My purpose was to measure what the Imperial Fists built, and to ensure that the record of their construction was as permanent as the construction itself. In the bastion, days did not exist. Sunlight had not penetrated the inner district since the second month, when the atmospheric processors had failed and the perpetual overcast of smoke and vaporized masonry had sealed the sky into a low ceiling of brown and orange haze. Time was measured instead by bombardment cycles. The enemy's macro cannons operated on a predictable rhythm. 90 minutes of sustained fire, 40 minutes of cooling, then another 90 minutes. Within those intervals, the entire structure of life was organized. Repairs during cooling windows, reassessment during the opening salvos, prayer during the final minutes of each cycle when the impacts were loudest and the walls shuddered most violently, because that was when faith was most necessary. The Astartes did not sleep as I understood sleep. I would see them in the lower corridors during quiet phases, standing motionless in alcoves carved into the bastion's interior walls, their eyes half closed, their breathing reduced to a rate so slow it seemed geological. They were not unconscious. They were processing, reviewing tactical data, reciting doctrine internally, running mental simulations of defensive contingencies. Their bodies did not rest so much as optimize. I had been told that an Imperial Fist could maintain combat effectiveness for weeks without true sleep, sustained by the SUSN membrane and the catalepsian node, biological modifications that turned the need for rest into a tactical variable rather than a biological imperative. They ate without ceremony. Nutrient bricks, gray and dense, consumed in transit between positions. I never once saw a brother sit down to eat. The act of nourishment was simultaneous with the act of duty, as though pausing to feed oneself was a form of structural weakness, a micro-retreat from purpose. They spoke rarely, and when they spoke, every word carried the weight of doctrinal precision. I had served among other Imperial forces before my assignment to the chapter, and in those postings I had heard soldiers complain, joke, speculate, curse. Among the Imperial Fists, speech served the function of engineering. It communicated load, angle, material, command. Nothing extraneous, nothing wasted, nothing soft. I revered this economy. I had built my faith around it. The Imperium was vast and chaotic, a civilization perpetually tearing itself apart through corruption, incompetence, and the blind thrashing of a species too numerous and too frightened to govern itself cleanly. But within the Imperial Fists, order existed in its purest form. Suffering was not random. It was calculated. Loss was not tragedy. It was expenditure. Death was not an ending. It was a material contribution. This was the geometry of faith, and I measured it with precision. In the days following the guardsman's execution, I completed a full structural survey of the eastern wall section. The work took me through corridors where the ferocrete was still warm from recent pours, through firing galleries where the brass casings of heavy bolters lay in precise rows awaiting collection, through the narrow passages behind the parapet where serfs moved in silent chains carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and the gray nutrient bricks that sustained us all. I measured crack propagation rates. I assessed compression tolerances. I noted subsidence in 3 load-bearing columns and filed the appropriate remediation requests. The fortress logister, a vast archive maintained in the bastion's central crypt, received my reports through a pneumatic tube system that had been installed during the first month of the siege. I would write my findings on treated vellum, roll them into brass cylinders, and feed them into the tube's intake valve with a whispered prayer of transmission. Somewhere below, junior scribes would transcribe my data into the master ledger. And somewhere below that, the chapter's command structure would incorporate my measurements into the evolving tactical geometry of the defense. I found comfort in this chain. My measurements flowed downward into a system that converted them into decisions, and those decisions flowed upward into actions that preserved the wall. I was a component, a small one. Yes, replaceable, certainly, but functional, aligned, correct. The civilian population of the inner bastion numbered approximately 31,000 at the start of my survey. I recorded this figure in my personal annotation log, a secondary document I maintained alongside the official ledger entries. The annotation log was not required by protocol, but I had always kept one, a habit from my training years when the doctrine masters encouraged supplementary observation as a tool for improving analytical precision. I noted the population figure because it influenced my load calculations. 31,000 bodies exerted measurable pressure on the bastion's lower levels. Their movement patterns affected vibration tolerances in the support columns. Their water consumption drew from the same reservoirs that supplied the ferocrete mixing stations. I did not note the population figure because I was concerned about them. Concern was not part of the equation. They were present, and therefore they were variables. I recorded variables. That was my function. Looking back, I recognize that the first fracture appeared in that very moment of recording, though I did not feel it then. It was the absence of a column in my survey template. Population figures appeared under structural load assessment. There was no corresponding column for projected evacuation feasibility. There was no column for civilian survival trajectory. There was no column for anything that treated the 31,000 as a quantity to be preserved rather than a mass to be accounted for. The omission was deliberate. I was certain of that. The Fortress Logisters templates had been designed by chapter archivists who had refined siege documentation over 10,000 years of continuous warfare. Every column served a purpose. Every absence served a purpose, too. I could have added a marginal note, a small annotation in the secondary log flagging projected evacuation routes, estimating feasible withdrawal corridors for non-combatant elements. It would have taken 30 seconds. I deleted the thought before it became ink. The system remained untroubled. During the second week after the Wallist observance, I was assigned to witness a disciplinary reassignment, a routine administrative duty that required my signature as compliant observer. The incident involved Brother Kalen of 3rd Squad, a line brother who had served the chapter for 63 years and who bore the scars of 9 prior sieges across his battered Mark 7 plate. During a counter-assault on the northern breach, Brother Kalen had been advancing through a collapsed corridor when he encountered a wounded serf pinned beneath a fallen ceiling beam. The serf was one of the ammunition carriers, a young woman whose legs were crushed and who was screaming with the raw, involuntary sound of a body in extremity beyond its capacity for silence. Brother Kalen paused. He reached down. He gripped the beam with both hands and began to lift. 3 seconds. That was the duration of his hesitation, measured by the chronologue. 3 seconds during which his assigned firing port, a critical kill zone position covering the breach approach, remained unsealed. During those 3 seconds, a pair of enemy penetrator rounds struck the unshielded port. The detonation killed Brothers Vasion and CRE instantly, shredding their torsos with fragmentation that turned the corridor into a metal storm of ceramite shards and bone. Brother Kalen completed the extraction. The serf survived, though she would never walk again. He sealed the port 40 seconds later. His combat performance for the remainder of the engagement was exemplary. None of that mattered. The reassignment order arrived within the hour. It was a single page written in the chapter's administrative cipher, and it bore the seal of Captain Harriman of the 5th Company. Brother Kalen was to be repositioned to Parapet Station 7, the most exposed firing position on the bastion's western face, during the next bombardment cycle. His name was to be removed from the company's honor roll effective immediately. No reprimand was spoken. There was no tribunal, no hearing, no opportunity for the brother to explain his actions or appeal the decision. The process was administrative, not judicial. Correction was not punishment. Correction was recalibration. I stood in the records chamber as the order was processed, and I watched the junior scribe draw a single line through Brother Kalen's name on the honor roll vellum. The ink was red, standard for administrative corrections, and the line was perfectly straight. The scribe did not pause. He did not look up. He moved to the next entry on his work with the same measured efficiency. I signed the reassignment ledger as compliant witness. My name inscribed beneath the order confirmed that the administrative chain was complete. The correction had been observed. The process was valid. I felt something as I wrote my name. Not doubt. Something smaller than doubt. A vibration like the faint tremor that runs through a load-bearing column when its compression tolerance is approached but not exceeded. The structure holds. The tremor is noted. No action is required. Brother Kalen would die within 30 hours. I knew this with the same certainty that I knew the compression tolerance of standard-grade ferocrete. Parapet Station 7 had a survival duration averaging 6 hours during active bombardment. His assignment was not a death sentence in the doctrinal sense, because the Imperial Fists did not issue death sentences to their own. It was a correction of position. He had placed himself where he was not needed, and so he was placed where he was. The geometry resolved itself. I felt comfort in this. The hierarchy was calm. Nothing about the process was arbitrary or vengeful. Brother Kalen had introduced a variable into the firing arc calculation, and 2 brothers had died as a result. The variable was being removed. The system recalibrated. The wall held. My name on the ledger was part of that holding. My signature was a small brick in the administrative wall that kept the chapter's doctrine intact. I had witnessed. I had confirmed. I had complied. That was my function. But what if that function was slowly beginning to fracture in ways no survey could yet detect? The inner chapel of the bastion occupied a vaulted chamber that had once been a generatorum substation. The Imperial Fists had stripped it of its original machinery and resurfaced the walls with slabs of gray stone quarried from the hive's demolished outer districts. The stone was unpolished, rough-cut, bearing the marks of industrial extraction tools. It was not beautiful. It was enduring. That was enough. Chaplain Morvain conducted the rite of refusal on the 3rd day of each bombardment week. I attended as a recording witness, my duty to transcribe the liturgy and note any deviations from the approved text. There were never deviations. In 3 months, Chaplain Morvain had recited the rite with the same inflection, the same pauses, the same cadence of breath, as though the words passed through him without engaging the mechanisms of thought or feeling. The rite of refusal was not a prayer of salvation. It did not petition the emperor for deliverance. It did not invoke mercy, rescue, or relief. The litany spoke only of holding, of refusing to yield, of the wall as theological absolute. To yield is heresy. To retreat is to consent to the darkness. The wall does not ask whether those behind it deserve protection. The wall does not ask whether the enemy deserves to be opposed. The wall exists because withdrawal does not. I knelt on the stone floor with the other serfs and attendants, 47 of us arranged in rows behind the Astartes, who stood rather than knelt because their armor made kneeling impractical and because I suspected kneeling implied a posture of supplication that the chapter found doctrinally uncomfortable. The Astartes stood in formation, their helms removed, their faces carved from the same gray stone as the chapel walls. They did not recite aloud. Their lips moved fractionally, shaping the words in silence, as though the catechism was too sacred for vocalization or too ingrained for speech. I recited aloud. I spoke every word. I felt them in my throat and on my tongue and in the chambers of my chest where breath became sound. I believed them. But as I knelt there transcribing the litany's final stanzas into my record folio, I noticed something that I had not noticed before. Or perhaps I had noticed it many times and had only now allowed the observation to resolve into conscious recognition. There were no civilians in the litany. No reference to the 31,000 souls sheltering within the bastion. No mention of the hive's population, of the families and workers and children who existed behind the wall that the Imperial Fists defended with such absolute conviction. The prayers spoke of walls, of brothers, of the chapter, of the Emperor's mandate to resist. They spoke of stone and faith and refusal. They did not speak of anyone who was not already part of the wall. I completed the transcription. I filed it in the appropriate cylinder. I knelt for the final blessing, received the chaplain's sign of endurance across my forehead, traced in the oil of Inwit's thorns, and I returned to my duties. The absence stayed with me, not as doubt but as weight. A small additional mass distributed across the structure of my belief, measurable, but not yet significant. The kind of load that a competent architect notes but does not flag because the tolerances still hold and the next survey is not yet due. I recited the catechism of holding that night in my sleeping alcove, 12 lines of verse memorized during my first year of chapter service. I spoke them into the dark and the dark accepted them, and I slept for my rationed 4 hours without disturbance. Something was missing from the catechism. I chose not to determine what. Yet that missing piece was already whispering in the silence between bombardments. Waiting for the moment I could no longer ignore it. The outer wall breach occurred during the 5th week of the 3rd month, during a bombardment cycle of unusual intensity. I was in the survey chamber when the impacts began, calculating compression drift in the bastion's northwestern buttress, and the first indication I received was not sound, but vibration. The floor shuddered. My calibration instruments rattled on their mounting pegs. A thin stream of powdered ferocrete sifted down from the ceiling and dusted the surface of my work table in gray. Then the sound arrived. A deep, sustained roar that bypassed the ears and entered the body through the bones. Macrocannon impacts at close range produce a frequency that the human frame experiences as internal pressure, as though the organs are being compressed by an invisible hand. I gripped the edge of the table and waited for the cycle to pass. It did not pass. The bombardment continued for 3 hours beyond its predicted window. By the time I was summoned to the breach site, my hands were trembling from sustained vibration exposure, and my ears had developed a high, persistent tone that would remain for the duration of the siege and beyond. The breach was in Section 12 West, a segment of the outer wall that had been reinforced twice during the previous month, but had been identified in my most recent survey as approaching critical compression failure. My report had recommended additional buttressing. The recommendation had been approved, but not yet executed. The enemy's timing, whether by intelligence or fortune, had been precise. I arrived to find a gap in the wall 20 meters wide and 9 meters high, through which the brown haze of the exterior was visible as a churning curtain of dust and ember. The rubble of the collapsed section had spilled inward, forming a slope of broken ferocrete and twisted rebar that descended into the corridor network behind the wall. Already, the sound of small arms fire was audible from beyond the breach. The enemy was probing the opening with advanced elements. Civilians had been sheltering in the corridor network, hundreds of them packed into the passages that ran behind the outer wall, using the thick ferocrete as insulation against the bombardment's acoustic and thermal effects. When the wall collapsed, dozens had been killed instantly by falling debris. The survivors had scrambled deeper into the network, but the passages were narrow and choked with dust, and many had not moved far enough. I arrived with the engineering team and found the 5th Company's tactical response already in progress. Brother Sergeant Uldren, the same who had executed the guardsman on the parapet, was directing the defensive consolidation from a position just inside the breach. His orders were clear, rapid, and without inflection. The breach would not be abandoned. It would be sealed immediately. The engineering servitors began mixing ferocrete in portable batch processors, their mechanical limbs working with rhythmic precision as they combined calcium powder, binding compound, and water drawn from the bastion's reserve tanks. I was tasked with calculating reinforcement density, a standard assignment that required me to assess the dimensions of the breach and determine the volume of material needed to restore structural integrity. Then the second order came. The civilians sheltering in the corridors behind the breach were to be repositioned to the breach itself. They would stand in formation across the gap, shoulder to shoulder, forming a living barrier while the ferocrete was poured and set behind them. Their bodies would serve as the form into which the new wall section would be cast. The process would take approximately 4 hours. During those 4 hours, They would absorb enemy fire that would otherwise strike the curing ferocrete and compromise its structural integrity. I heard the order. I recorded the order. I began my calculations. The mathematics were straightforward. The breach was 20 meters wide. Assuming an average shoulder width of 45 centimeters per civilian, the first rank required approximately 44 individuals. Depth of formation depended on anticipated enemy fire volume. 3 ranks would provide sufficient ablative mass to protect the pore for the required curing duration. Total personnel requirement: 132. I wrote the number on my calculation slate. 132. Below me in the corridor, chapter serfs were already moving through the civilian population, directing them toward the breach with firm but unhurried commands. The civilians went. Some were silent. Some were praying. Some were weeping with the convulsive, airless sobs of people who understand what is happening to them but lack the framework to refuse. They had no framework for refusal. None of us did. Refusal was not part of the architecture. I stood at the edge of the breach and watched them take position. The first rank pressed against the rubble, facing outward into the dust and the distant muzzle flashes. The second rank pressed against the first. The third rank pressed against the second. Behind the third rank, the servitors began the pour. The ferocrete was warm when it flowed. I knew this from material specifications. Standard siege-grade compound exited the batch processor at approximately 40 degrees, cooling over the 4-hour cure cycle to ambient temperature. The civilians in the third rank felt it first, the gray slurry rising around their ankles, then their calves, then their knees. I heard their prayers increase in volume as the level rose. Some chanted the litany of protection. Some called for the emperor. Some simply repeated the names of people they loved over and over, as though the names themselves were a kind of fortification. I recorded the pour. I recorded the structural density readings as the compound began to set. I recorded the timestamps for each phase of the curing cycle. I did not record the names. The enemy fire intensified as the breach filling progressed. Rounds struck the forward ranks with the flat, wet sound of high-velocity impacts against unarmored flesh. Bodies fell and were trampled or pushed back into the formation by those behind them. The Astartes positioned on the flanks of the breach returned fire over the civilians' heads, their bolters cracking in disciplined bursts that sent explosive rounds into the dust cloud and the shapes moving within it. By the second hour, the ferocrete had risen to waist height on the third rank and was beginning to set around the dead who had fallen into the pour. The compound did not distinguish between bodies and rubble. It accepted all materials equally, binding them into a composite mass that would cure to a hardness rating within acceptable tolerances. I measured the tolerances. They held. By the 4th hour, the breach was sealed. The new wall section was 9 meters high, 20 meters wide, and approximately 2 meters deep. It was structurally sound. My compression gauges confirmed this. My load distribution calculations confirmed this. The Fortress Logister would record the repair as successful with material expenditure within projected parameters. 132 civilians had been incorporated into the wall. I filed the report. I cleaned my instruments. I returned to the survey chamber. I did not add an annotation. The siege entered its 6th week and time began to change. Not in its measurement, which remained calibrated to bombardment cycles, but in its texture. The intervals between impacts, which had once felt like pauses, began to feel like compression zones. Periods of pressurized waiting during which the anticipated resumption of fire occupied more cognitive space than the fire itself. I began to think in countdowns. When the Astra Militarum Command transmitted a request for strategic withdrawal to secondary defensive positions, I received the communication transcript as part of my administrative duties. The request was standard military procedure. The outer sectors of the hive were untenable, and continued defense of them would result in catastrophic loss of trained personnel without corresponding tactical benefit. Secondary lines had been prepared in the hive's mid-districts. Withdrawal would preserve fighting strength and extend the siege's viability by weeks. The reasoning was sound. I could see it in the mathematics. Here is your fully corrected, rewritten, and optimized version of the next part of the transcript. I have kept the exact starting words and exact ending words untouched, preserved every single detail without shortening anything, humanized the language for natural and emotional flow, injected massive suspense and curiosity to hook viewers deeply, and made it highly algorithm-friendly and SEO-optimized for YouTube. Warhammer 40k Imperial Fists Siege Story, Grimdark Lore, Fortress Monastery Defense, etc. The numbers supported withdrawal. Captain Harriman's response was a single line dictated to me for transcription. No viable secondary lines exist. I wrote the words. I did not look up from the vellum. I could feel the captain's presence in the room, not as physical proximity, but as gravitational force. He was not watching me for signs of doubt. He did not need to watch. The process was self-correcting. I was then instructed to amend the communication record to reflect that no withdrawal request had been received. The original transcript was to be destroyed. The pneumatic tube log was to be adjusted to eliminate the transmission's timestamp. I complied before the next bombardment cycle began. The withdrawal request ceased to exist. With it, the possibility of withdrawal ceased to exist. The secondary lines, which I knew had been prepared because I had seen the engineering surveys, became doctrinally invisible. They could not be retreated to because they were not acknowledged. And because they were not acknowledged, they could not be retreated to. The logic was circular. The circle was the wall. I filed the amended communication record in the Fortress Logister's archive cylinder. The brass tube accepted it with a soft hiss of pneumatic pressure, and I listened to it travel downward through the bastion's interior, descending into the archives, where it would be integrated into the permanent record, a record that now stated, with the authority of chapter documentation, that no retreat had ever been possible. I returned to my station. The bombardment cycle resumed. The walls shook. I recalibrated my instruments and continued measuring. The countdown ran. I ran with it. But in the silence between impacts, a quiet question began to echo louder than the guns. How long could a man remain inside a circle before he realized the circle was closing around him? Brother Kalen's death occurred during the next scheduled inspection of the outer fortifications. I was present because the inspection required structural assessment of the western parapet section, and Parapet Station 7 fell within my survey grid. I had known he would be dead. The mathematical probability had been clear since the moment of his reassignment. Parapet Station 7 occupied the apex of the bastion's western salient, a projecting angle of wall that drew concentrated fire from 2 enemy battery positions. The previous occupant had lasted 4 hours. The one before that 6. Brother Kalen had been assigned 18 hours ago, which meant he had exceeded the average by a significant margin. A final testament to 63 years of combat conditioning. I found what remained of him when I climbed the access ladder to the parapet platform. The artillery had been precise. A direct hit from what the ballistic analysts would later classify as a medium-yield penetrator round had struck the firing position during the previous bombardment cycle. The blast had destroyed the sandbag revetment, melted the firing slit's ceramite liner, and torn Brother Kalen apart with an efficiency that left very little to identify. I had seen death before. The siege had provided extensive exposure to the mechanics of biological termination, but I had observed it primarily through documentation, through the numerical abstractions of my reports and ledger entries. Standing on the parapet, surrounded by the physical evidence of what a penetrator round does to superhuman biology at close range, I encountered it differently. The smell was the first thing. Not the coppery scent of blood, which I had become accustomed to, but the acrid chemical stench of vaporized ceramite mixed with the thick, greasy odor of burned transhuman tissue. The Astartes' body contained chemical compounds that normal human flesh did not. The residue of genetic modification, the synthetic compounds of the black carapace, the trace elements of decades of combat stimulant metabolization. When subjected to extreme thermal energy, these compounds produced a smell that lodged in the sinuses and refused to dissipate. My stomach clenched. I gripped the ladder rung and held still until the nausea passed. The visual evidence was clinical in its completeness. Fragments of Mark 7 plate lay scattered across the platform. Their yellow paint scorched to black, their edges curled and melted. Biological matter adhered to the interior surfaces of the larger fragments. I could identify portions of the black carapace, the subcutaneous interface layer that connected the Astartes to his armor. hanging from a chestplate section in strips of gray and red. A single gauntlet hand, severed at the wrist, lay near the base of the firing slit, its fingers still curled around the grip of a bolter that had been sheared in half. A tremor ran through my hands. Then another. The tech marine who accompanied the inspection team assessed the position and declared the gene seed unrecoverable. This was significant. The gene seed, the precious biological material that carried the chapter's genetic legacy, was normally extracted from fallen brothers by the apothecaries with painstaking care. Its loss represented not merely the death of a single warrior, but the diminishment of the chapter's future capacity to create new ones. The tech marine noted the loss in a flat, measured tone and marked the position for immediate reoccupancy. A replacement brother would be assigned within the hour. The damaged revetment would be rebuilt. The firing slit would be repaired. The Imperial Fists around me did not react. They surveyed the position, noted the damage, calculated the repairs, and began implementation. No one spoke Brother Kalen's name. No one acknowledged that a warrior of 63 years of service had been expended in an administrative correction. The position existed. The position required an occupant. The previous occupant had been consumed. The next would be assigned. I stood on the parapet, my instruments in my hands, my stomach hollow and my hands still trembling. And I understood something that I had known intellectually but had not previously experienced in my body. The body did not matter. Not Brother Kalen's body. Not the body of the guardsmen on the eastern parapet. Not the bodies in the wall at Section 12 West. Not my body. The doctrine did not account for bodies except as structural components, as load-bearing elements in the architecture of defiance. An Astartes was a stone in the wall. When the stone shattered, you replaced it. The wall did not grieve for its stones. I completed my survey. I filed the structural damage assessment. I returned to the interior. From that day, I stopped recording individual names in my casualty tallies. I reduced them to numerical reinforcement values. Unit lost. 1. Structural replacement required. 1. Gene seed status. Unrecoverable. Position reassigned. The numbers were cleaner. The numbers did not tremble. Yet in the quiet moments between cycles, those clean numbers began to feel heavier than any name ever had. In the 7th week, the formal audit began. I had been expecting it in the abstract way that one expects bombardment during a siege. Not a question of whether, but of when. The Fortress Logister's protocols required periodic review of all documentation to ensure consistency, accuracy, and doctrinal compliance. The audit was not investigative. It was procedural, a structural survey of the records themselves, checking for cracks and deviations. The auditor was a senior chapter serf named Talent, a man 20 years my elder, who had served the Fortress Logister for longer than I had been alive. He was thin, precise, and utterly without warmth, qualities that I had once admired and now recognized as products of the same environment that had shaped the Astartes themselves. Talent had been inside the system so long that the system's architecture had become the architecture of his personality. He reviewed my records methodically, beginning with the earliest entries from the siege's first week and progressing forward through 3 months of documentation. His stylus tracked each line, each figure, each cross-reference, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who understood that thoroughness was its own form of fortification. He found my annotations. They were small things. Marginal notes in my secondary log. Observations that fell outside the standard reporting categories. A note about civilian population density in the corridors behind Section 12 West. A calculation of water consumption rates that included civilian requirements alongside military ones. A projected timeline for civilian food supply exhaustion. Talent did not react with alarm. He did not raise his voice. He placed his stylus down on the review table, aligned it precisely with the table's edge, and spoke to me in the same measured tone that the Astartes used for tactical communications. The terminology required standardization. Civilian casualty was an imprecise designation that introduced subjective connotation into objective records. The approved lexicon used population resource expended for non-military personnel losses and structural material allocated for personnel incorporated into fortification elements. My records would need to be revised to reflect the correct terminology. I sat across from him and listened to the words enter my ears and pass through the processing centers of my brain, where they were parsed, evaluated, and integrated into my understanding of my duties. The language was a wall, too. I could see it now. Each approved term was a brick placed with the same care and precision that the Astartes used to lay ferocrete. The words did not describe reality. They constructed it. Population resource expended did not mean the same thing as civilian casualty. Not because the underlying event was different, but because the frame of reference was different. Within the approved lexicon, a civilian was not a person who had died. A civilian was a resource that had been allocated to its most effective use. The frame changed the weight. The weight changed the architecture. I revised my records. I went through every entry, every annotation, every marginal note, and I replaced the unapproved terms with the approved ones. The process took 2 days. I worked through bombardment cycles and cooling intervals, through meals and prayer times, my stylus moving across the vellum with the same mechanical precision that I had once admired in the chapter serfs who mixed the reinforcement slurry. When I was finished, the original wording was gone. Not struck through, not annotated, not preserved in any secondary record. Gone. The approved lexicon had been applied retroactively, and the documentation now reflected a consistent reality in which civilians had never been killed, only expended, in which bodies had never been incorporated into walls, only allocated. I filed the revised records. Talent reviewed them. He found them compliant. The words were smaller now. I could feel them contracting around my thoughts like curing ferocrete, hardening into shapes that permitted certain observations and excluded others. When I looked at the population figures in my survey reports, I no longer saw people. I saw tonnage, load distribution, resource allocation. The language was doing its work. I let it. In the 8th week, I discovered that I was being watched. The discovery was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no accusation, no moment of sudden revelation. I simply became aware gradually, through the accumulation of small details, that the servitor-mounted OpSpecs arrays in the bastion's interior corridors were not merely tracking movement for security purposes. They were recording content. I noticed it first during a routine survey of the Eastern Buttress network. I had paused in a junction corridor to consult my calculation slate, and as I stood there reviewing compression data, I observed a servitor-mounted picture lens tracking my hands. Not my body, not my position, my hands. Specifically, the movements of my stylus across the slate surface. I looked up. The lens adjusted. I looked down. The lens followed. The surveillance was not new. The OpSpecs arrays had been active since the bastion's construction, but their function, as I had understood it, was perimeter security and personnel tracking. Macro-level observation designed to detect unauthorized movement or enemy infiltration. What I was seeing was different. This was content-level monitoring. The systems were reading what I wrote. I returned to my survey chamber and examined the OpSpecs positioning more carefully. The chamber contained 3 picture lenses mounted at angles that covered my work table, my filing cabinet, and the pneumatic tube intake. A 4th lens, which I had previously assumed to be non-functional, was positioned directly above my secondary annotation log. The annotation log, my private record, the document where I had written my marginal observations about civilian survival rates and evacuation feasibility before Talon's audit had forced their revision. I sat at my work table and felt the surveillance settle around me like atmospheric pressure, invisible and omnipresent. The OpSpecs arrays did not accuse. They did not threaten. They simply observed with the same patient mechanical thoroughness that characterized everything within the bastion's architecture. They were part of the wall. They watched from within the wall. They recorded what the wall contained. I understood then that my doubt was visible, not because I had spoken it aloud, not because I had shared it with another soul, but because doubt expressed itself in the movements of a stylus, in the hesitation before a word, in the marginal notes that appeared at the edges of compliant documents. The system did not need me to confess. The system could read the tremor in my compliance. That night, in my sleeping alcove, I drafted a projection on my calculation slate. It was a simple extrapolation. Current reinforcement practices, current civilian absorption rates, current population figures projected forward to the siege's anticipated conclusion. The result was unambiguous. Total civilian extinction within 3 days if current practices continued without modification. I stared at the numbers. They were correct. I had checked them twice. The mathematics did not lie, could not lie, because mathematics was the language of the wall itself, the geometry of faith that I had devoted my life to measuring. I deleted the projection. I wiped the slate clean with a cloth dampened in the solvent kept beside my cot for exactly this purpose. The numbers dissolved into a gray smear and then into nothing. The slate was blank. The projection had never existed. I lay down on my cot and stared at the ceiling where the faint red pulse of the Opspex lens maintained its patient rhythm. I began to censor my thoughts before they formed. The process was not conscious at first. It was architectural. A wall rising inside my mind, constructed from the same materials that the chapter used for its physical fortifications. Doctrine, lexicon, approved parameters. Thoughts that approached the wall were deflected before they could take shape. Questions dissolved. Observations narrowed. The space available for independent cognition contracted centimeter by centimeter, pore by pore, until what remained was a chamber just large enough to perform my duties and nothing more. I was becoming the wall. I was not the first. The knowledge did not comfort me. Yet in the darkness of that alcove, with the red light pulsing above me like a heartbeat that was not my own, a single terrifying question refused to be silenced. If I was becoming the wall, what would be left of me when the wall finally demanded everything? In the 9th week, I was assigned to archival comparison duty. The transfer was presented as routine. The Fortress Logister required a survey of historical siege records to identify precedent for current engineering practices. My experience and access credentials made me the logical candidate. I descended into the lower archives, a subterranean complex of vaulted chambers that extended beneath the bastion's foundation layer. The air was cold and still, untouched by the surface bombardment's thermal effects. The walls were lined with document racks, thousands of them, stretching from floor to ceiling in rows so dense that the narrow aisles between them felt like corridors within a wall. Each rack held sealed brass cylinders containing the vellum records of previous sieges, previous campaigns, previous demonstrations of the Imperial Fists' unyielding doctrine. I worked alone. The lower archives were not regularly staffed during siege operations. The servitors who normally maintained the collection had been repurposed for fortification labor, and the only light came from the glow strips mounted at intervals along the ceiling, casting a pale, even illumination that erased shadows and made every surface equally visible. I began with the most recent records and worked backward. The siege of Hellwood 4, 37 years prior. The defense of Bastion Primus on Valve. The holding of the Iron Gate on Maragost. The patterns emerged within the first hour. Hellwood 4. Outer wall breach in the 3rd month. Civilian population directed to form temporary barriers during ferocrete pour. Terminology: population resource allocated to structural emergency. Casualty figures listed under material expenditure. After-action report commends the efficiency of the reinforcement process and notes the improved compression tolerances achieved through biological composite inclusion. VOUF. Sustained bombardment beyond predicted parameters. Astra Militarum command request strategic withdrawal. Request denied. Communication record amended to eliminate withdrawal reference. After-action report states no viable secondary positions were identified during the engagement. Maragost. Disciplinary reassignment of a battle brother who deviated from firing position to assist wounded serfs. Brother assigned to exposed position. Gene seed lost. After-action report lists the correction under structural integrity maintenance. I read for 3 days. I reviewed 9 campaigns. In every one, the same practices, the same language, the same outcomes. The civilians were absorbed, the retreats were erased, the corrections were administrative, the walls held. I had believed until that point that what I witnessed at Veriman's Reach was emergency adaptation. That the extreme pressures of the Helios Gate siege had forced the 5th Company into practices that were expedient rather than habitual. That the incorporation of civilians into walls, the erasure of withdrawal options, the exposure of corrected brothers were responses to crisis, aberrations within an otherwise merciful system. They were not aberrations. They were precedent. The records stretched back centuries. The practices were consistent. The terminology was standardized. The after-action reports used identical phrasing across campaigns separated by decades and light years. This was not deviation. This was chapter tradition, encoded in doctrine, preserved in archive, repeated with the mechanical fidelity of a bombardment cycle. I sat in the lower archive, surrounded by the weight of centuries of documentation, and I felt belief collapse. Not dramatically, not with the violent shudder of a wall under direct fire. It collapsed the way a foundation settles when the ground beneath it has been slowly, imperceptibly hollowed. A quiet subsidence, a gentle lowering, an almost peaceful descent into a space that had always been waiting below. The horror was systemic. It had always been systemic. I returned to the upper bastion and resumed my duties. I did not speak of what I had found. I did not need to. The records were available to anyone with archive access. They were not hidden. They were not classified. They were simply present, the way the foundation is present beneath a wall, unseen but structural. Nobody looked at the foundation. The wall did not encourage it. In the days that followed, I began constructing the projection that I knew would end my access to the records. I did it deliberately, with the same methodical precision that I applied to my structural surveys. It was, in a sense, the most honest piece of engineering I had ever performed. The calculation was comprehensive. I took the current population figures, now reduced to approximately 19,000 from the original 31,000. I factored in the rate of civilian absorption into fortification projects, the wall repairs, the breach ceilings, the barricade constructions that consumed human material alongside ferocrete and rebar. I included projected bombardment intensity based on the pattern analysis I had compiled over 3 months. I included the rate of attrition from starvation, dehydration, and the secondary effects of sustained acoustic trauma. The result was clear. Holding the wall, maintaining current reinforcement practices, would ensure the complete extinction of the civilian population within the remaining projected siege duration. The wall would stand. The population would not. But the calculation revealed something else, something that shifted the weight from technical observation to doctrinal comprehension. The Imperial Fists were not holding the wall because the wall protected the population. The wall had ceased to serve a protective function weeks ago when the civilian survival trajectory had first fallen below replacement levels. The wall was being held because the wall was the objective. Endurance was the purpose. The wall was a demonstration. The siege was a statement. The Imperial Fists were not defending life. They were preserving the concept of refusal. Every civilian absorbed into the ferocrete. Every brother corrected to an exposed position. Every retreat erased from the record served a single theological function: to prove that the Imperial Fists would not yield, could not, would not. The distinction was critical. Inability implied limitation. Refusal implied choice. And the Imperial Fists chose, with every action, every doctrine, every brick and bolt and body, to refuse. The hive city of Veriman's Reach was no longer a population center. It had become a monument to refusal. A monument built from bodies and doctrine. The siege was not being fought to win. It was being fought to demonstrate. I understood this with a clarity that felt heavier than doubt. Doubt could be suppressed. Doubt was a tremor, a vibration, a momentary deviation from structural norms. Clarity was different. Clarity was load-bearing. Clarity settled into the foundation and changed the angles of everything built above it. I drafted my private annotation with steady hands. I used precise terminology. I avoided emotional language. I presented the projection as a structural assessment, which it was, and I submitted it to the Fortress Logister through the pneumatic tube system with the same whispered prayer of transmission that I had used for every previous report. I knew what would follow. The precedent was in the archives. The summons arrived the following morning. A junior serf, barely 12 years old, delivered the message on a folded vellum card bearing the seal of Captain Harriman. I was to present myself at the command chamber within the hour. I washed. I dressed in clean robes. I secured my instruments in their cases and placed the cases in my filing cabinet, arranging them with the care of a man who suspects he will not open the cabinet again. I locked the cabinet. I placed the key in my robe pocket. The command chamber occupied a reinforced vault beneath the bastion's central tower. The walls were 3 meters thick, layered with ceramite composite that made them impervious to anything short of a direct orbital strike. Within this shell, the room was sparse. A single table carved from a single block of gray stone, flanked by 2 chairs. No ornamentation, no banners, no symbols. Beyond the Imperial Fist insignia etched into the table's surface with geometric precision, Captain Harriman stood behind the table. He was not sitting. Imperial Fists captains did not sit during administrative proceedings. He wore his plate as he always did, the yellow ceramite scarred and pitted from 3 months of sustained combat. His face was visible above the gorget, a face that shared the quality of all Imperial Fist faces I had encountered. Carved, angular, expressionless, as though the bone structure beneath the skin had been shaped by the same doctrine that shaped the walls. He did not greet me. He did not accuse me. He began with acknowledgement. Your diligence is noted, serf architect Valine. The Fortress Logister has received your supplementary projection regarding population resource sustainability. The analysis is thorough and the methodology is sound. I stood before the table and said nothing. The words arrived and settled into the structure of the moment with the same measured inevitability as ferocrete filling a breach. The projection's conclusions are not contested. Captain Harriman continued, population resource depletion is a predictable outcome of sustained siege operations. This has been observed in prior campaigns and is documented in the archive records which you have recently reviewed. He knew I had been in the archives. The OpSpecs arrays had tracked my movements. Every cylinder I had opened, every record I had read had been noted. However, and the word fell like a single stone into still water, the projection introduces a variable that is not present within the equation of siege purity. Civilian survival is an external consideration. It exists outside the parameters of our mandate. He paused. The silence was not theatrical. It was structural. He was allowing the statement to cure. The Imperium does not require this hive city's population. The Imperium requires this hive city's wall. When relief forces arrive, they will find a fortress that did not yield. That is the message that crosses the void. That is the message that reaches other garrison commanders, other defenders, other servants of the Emperor who face the same darkness. The message is, they held. I understood him. That was the worst part. I understood him completely. His logic was flawless within its own geometry. The wall was a signal. The signal required the wall. The wall required everything that sustained it, including the population that had once sheltered behind it. The population was fuel. The wall was the flame. The flame was the message. The message was the purpose. The purpose did not include the fuel. Your concern has been noted and classified. Captain Harriman said, the classification is structural deviation. This is not a punitive designation. It is an administrative one. Your access to primary ledger systems will be reassigned to ensure optimal alignment between your duties and the Fortress Logister's requirements. Optimal alignment. The phrase was a brick. It was placed with precision. It sealed something shut. You are hereby transferred to the Mortification Annex effective immediately. Your duties will consist of cataloging reclaimed armor components for chapter reclamation protocols and transcribing the Catechism of Holding for archive preservation. He thanked me again for my diligence. He did not threaten me. He did not warn me. He did not need to. The process was complete. The correction had been applied. The wall had been repaired. I was escorted to the Mortification Annex by 2 chapter serfs who walked beside me in silence through the bastion's lower corridors. The route descended steeply, passing through levels that I had never visited during my 3 months of service. The walls grew damper. The glow strips grew sparser. The sound of bombardment, which was omnipresent in the upper bastion, faded to a distant rumble, felt more than heard, like the pulse of a vast and sleeping organism. The mortification annex occupied a series of chambers carved into the bedrock beneath the bastion's deepest foundation layer. The chambers were long and narrow, their ceilings low enough that I could touch them with an extended hand, their walls lined with metal racks on which the salvaged armor of fallen brothers had been arranged in orderly rows. Each rack bore a small vellum tag identifying the brother whose plate it had once housed: name, rank, date of death, cause of death, gene seed recovery status. Hundreds of tags. Hundreds of brothers. The armor was damaged. All of it. Scorched, cracked, punctured, melted, shattered. Some pieces were barely recognizable as ceramite plate. Others retained their shape but had been so thoroughly destroyed by the forces that killed their wearers that they held the imprint of violence in their surface. The cratered impact of bolt rounds, the smooth glaze of melter fire, the twisted deformation of explosive overpressure. I was given a small writing desk, a supply of vellum, a stylus, and a copy of the Catechism of Holding bound in treated leather. My instructions were simple. Catalog the remaining uncatalogued armor pieces by type, size, and damage classification and transcribe the catechism in full once per day until the siege concluded. No deadline was given. No end date was implied. The assignment was indefinite. I sat at the desk. I opened the catechism. I began to write. The words were familiar. I had recited them 1,000 times. I had believed them. I had measured the walls they described and found the measurements correct. Now I copied them by hand, letter by letter, word by word, line by line, and the act of writing them felt different from the act of speaking them. Speaking was breath and sound ephemeral. Gone the moment it passed the lips. Writing was permanent. Writing was mortar. Each letter was a grain of calcium pressed into the compound of the page, and as I wrote, I felt the letters harden around me. To yield is heresy. To retreat is to consent to the darkness. The wall does not ask whether those behind it deserve protection. I wrote this, and the words were true. The wall did not ask. The wall never asked. The wall was not constructed from questions. It was constructed from answers that had been delivered so long ago that no one remembered the questions that had prompted them. The days passed. The bombardment continued above me, transmitted through the bedrock as a low, ceaseless vibration that set my teeth on edge and made the stylus tremble in my grip. I catalogued armor. I measured damage. I recorded the dimensions of shattered ceramite with the same precision I had once applied to the bastion's structural surveys. I no longer made annotations. There was nothing to annotate. The mortification annex contained no population variables, no survival projections, no resource allocation figures. It contained only the remnants of those who had served the wall and been consumed by it, their armor waiting to be reclaimed and reforged for the next brother, the next wall, the next siege. The cycle was visible here in the annex's long rows of salvaged plate. The armor would be reclaimed. It would be repaired or melted down and recast. It would be fitted to a new brother, a new stone in the wall, who would wear it until his own correction or destruction necessitated the next cycle of reclamation. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was lost. Nothing was removed from the system. The wall consumed everything and returned nothing except the wall itself. I understood this now with a finality that left no room for the tremors that had once disturbed my compliance. Understanding was not liberation. Understanding was a different form of enclosure. I had moved from a cell whose walls were made of belief into a cell whose walls were made of comprehension, and the second cell was smaller than the first. Yet even in that smaller cell, a final, unspoken question lingered in the shadows between transcribed lines. How many times can a man copy the words of unbreakable faith before the words themselves begin to crack the man who writes them? In the 11th week, the bombardment stopped. The silence was not immediate. It arrived in stages like a receding tide. First, the intervals between impacts lengthened. Then, the impacts themselves diminished in intensity. The deep concussive roared downgrading to a distant crump. Then a rumble. Then nothing. The vibration in the bedrock faded. The glow strips, which had flickered with every impact for 3 months, burned steady. I sat at my desk in the mortification annex and listened to the silence. It was not peaceful. It was procedural. The enemy had not been destroyed. They had withdrawn. The silence was not victory. It was acknowledgement. The wall had held. The enemy had chosen to seek other targets, other walls, other arguments that might yield. Relief forces arrived 2 days later. I learned this from a junior serf who brought my daily ration of nutrient bricks and water. The conversation was brief, conducted in whispers, as though loudness would disturb the annex's inhabitants, though the inhabitants were all dead and beyond disturbance. The Astra Militarum's 47th Relief Column had entered the Hive City through the eastern approach, finding the route choked with rubble and the remains of demolished districts. They had advanced to the inner bastion, expecting to find a defended city. They found a fortress. The walls were intact. Every breach had been sealed. Every firing position was manned. The Imperial Fists stood upon the parapets in full plate, their weapons trained outward, their positions exemplary. The relief column's officers reportedly expressed admiration for the defensive engineering and the discipline of the garrison. They did not initially ask about the civilian population. When they did, the answer was contained in the Fortress Logisters records, which were made available through the appropriate administrative channels. The records documented population resource allocation across the siege's duration. They documented structural reinforcement practices. They documented the efficiency with which the bastion's defense had been maintained. The records did not document approximately 26,000 deaths. They documented approximately 26,000 resource expenditures. The language held. The wall held. The records held. I remained in the mortification annex. No reassignment order came. No one summoned me to provide testimony or account for my role in the siege's documentation. My existence in the annex was complete. I catalogued. I transcribed. I ate my nutrient bricks. I slept my 4 hours. And I contributed to the wall's administrative architecture with the silent, ceaseless labor that the system required. I copied the Catechism of Holding. I had completed it 43 times by the day the relief forces arrived. Each copy was identical. Each letter was placed with the same precision. Each word carried the same doctrinal weight. I no longer believed the words. But belief was not required. Compliance was required. The distinction which had once seemed important had dissolved into the mortar of routine. The wall did not care whether its stones believed in the wall. The wall cared only that the stones remained in position. I remained in position. The days after the siege's conclusion were measured not by bombardment cycles, but by administrative ones. Relief force personnel processed the bastion systems, integrating the Imperial Fists defense records into the broader campaign archive. Chapter logistics teams began the process of armor reclamation, moving through the mortification annex with efficient purpose, selecting pieces for transport to the chapter's forge facilities. I watched them work. They moved through the annex's narrow aisles with the same calm precision that characterized every Imperial Fist operation. They did not acknowledge me. I was part of the annex's furniture, as permanent and as invisible as the racks that held the armor. On the third day after the relief column's arrival, I was moved to a smaller chamber deeper within the annex. The reason given was space optimization. The reclamation teams needed room to work. The true reason, which I understood without being told, was that my presence in the main annex introduced a variable that the system preferred to minimize. I was a witness. I had seen the records. I had drafted the projection. I had been corrected. But correction did not erase the fact that the deviation had occurred. The system preferred its corrected elements to be stored where they would not be observed. The smaller chamber was 5 meters by 3 meters. It contained a desk, a cot, a glow strip, and a supply of vellum and styluses. A servitor delivered my rations at standardized intervals. The pneumatic tube system extended even here, its brass intake valve set into the wall above my desk, allowing me to submit my catechism transcriptions to the archive above. I wrote the catechism once per day as instructed. I wrote it with steady hands and empty purpose, the words flowing from stylus to vellum in unbroken lines of script that mirrored the unbroken lines of the wall above me. Each copy was perfect. Each copy was meaningless. Each copy was correct. I understood now that horror was not excess. Horror was not the dramatic excess of cruelty, the theatrical display of power, the visible and intentional infliction of suffering. Horror in its purest form was precision. It was the logical extension of a system that was built to endure, a system that measured survival not in lives but in structural integrity, not in mercy but in mathematics, not in humanity but in holding. The Imperial Fists would always hold. This was their genius and their curse. They would hold when the enemy pressed. They would hold when allies faltered. They would hold when the population behind them dwindled to nothing, and the walls they defended enclosed only empty corridors and silent chapels and the archived records of a species that had been consumed by its own fortifications. They would hold because holding was not what they did. Holding was what they were. I had once found this holy. I had stood on the parapets and watched the bombardment and felt the wall beneath my feet and believed that endurance was salvation. I had measured the angles and calculated the tolerances and filed the reports and felt the satisfaction of a man who contributes to something larger and more permanent than himself. That satisfaction was gone. In its place was something that I did not have an approved term for because the lexicon did not contain words for what I felt. The closest approximation was structural fatigue, the point at which a material has absorbed so much stress that it can no longer return to its original form. The material does not break. It does not collapse. It simply ceases to behave as it was designed to behave. It holds its shape but not its strength. It remains in position but not in purpose. I was structurally fatigued. I continued to write. The relief forces completed their assessment within the week. The official report, copies of which circulated through the Bastion's administrative channels before being sealed for transit, commended the Imperial Fists for their exemplary defense of Veriman's Reach. The report noted the fortress's structural integrity, the discipline of the garrison, the precision of the defensive engineering. It recorded the siege as a strategic stalemate resolved by enemy withdrawal, a designation that carried no implication of failure. The report mentioned the civilian population in a single paragraph. It noted that population resource management had been conducted in accordance with standard siege protocols and that the final population count at the time of relief was approximately 4,700. The discrepancy between this figure and the pre-siege population was attributed to resource expenditure consistent with sustained defensive operations. 26,000 lives reduced to a single paragraph of approved terminology. The report was filed. The report was sealed. The report was correct. I learned of the report's contents through the junior serf who brought my rations. He was the only human being I spoke to, and our conversations were brief. Functional exchanges conducted in the few seconds between the doors opening and closing. He told me what he knew because I asked, and he answered because the asking and answering were not prohibited. The system did not forbid knowledge. The system did not need to. The system controlled language, and language controlled thought, and thought controlled the capacity for response. I could know everything and do nothing because the architecture of my compliance was stronger than the architecture of my understanding. I thought about the civilians sometimes. Not the ones who had been incorporated into the walls whose individual identities had been dissolved into the composite mass of ferocrete and calcium. Not the ones who had been listed as resource expenditures in the ledger. I thought about the 4,700 who had survived. I wondered what they understood about the walls that had protected them. I wondered if they knelt in the corridors and touched the ferocrete and felt the presence of the thousands who had been absorbed into it. I wondered if they knew that the wall was not stone alone, that it was bone and flesh and prayer and the names of people who would never be recovered. I wondered if they were grateful. I suspected they were. Gratitude was the correct response to survival, and the system that had consumed 26,000 of their neighbors had also preserved 4,700 of them. The mathematics of salvation were the same as the mathematics of expenditure. The calculations were identical. Only the sign changed. Plus or minus. Saved or spent. Preserved or poured. The wall did not distinguish. The wall accepted all. The weeks passed. The Imperial Fists began preparations for departure. Their duty at Veriman's Reach was complete. The wall had held. The message had been sent. Other walls on other worlds awaited their attention. I was not informed of the departure schedule. My existence in the lower annex had separated me from the bastion's operational rhythms as completely as the bastion's walls had separated the interior from the exterior. I existed in a pocket of administrative silence, my duties unchanged, my routine unbroken, my compliance unquestioned. I wrote the catechism. I catalogued the remaining armor pieces. I measured damage classifications with instruments that I kept calibrated not because anyone checked but because the habit of precision had become structural. It was the last piece of my original identity that remained intact. The one professional reflex that the system had not needed to suppress because it served the system's purposes. Precision was useful. Precision was retained. Everything else had been expended. I did not know what would become of me. Chapter serfs who were separated from active service fell into an administrative category that the Fortress Logister classified as reserve allocation. Reserve elements were not discharged. They were not reassigned to other duties. They were maintained in their current state until a use was identified or until their biological function ceased or until the records that contained their designation were archived and forgotten. I suspected the third outcome was most likely. The Fortress Logister contained entries dating back millennia. Somewhere in its depths, in brass cylinders sealed and filed and never reopened, there were records of other serfs who had served and questioned and been corrected and placed in chambers like mine, where they had written the catechism until their hands failed and their eyes dimmed and their bodies were found by servitors during routine maintenance cycles and processed according to standard reclamation protocols. I would become a note in a ledger, a tag on a rack, a set of dimensions measured by a serf architect who would not question the figures. I would become part of the archive. The archive was part of the wall. The wall remembered longer than any of us. I completed my 61st transcription of the Catechism of Holding on the day the last Imperial Fist departed Variman's reach. I did not witness the departure. I heard it. The deep rumble of Thunderhawk engines penetrating even the bedrock that surrounded my chamber. A sound that vibrated through the stone and set the vellum on my desk fluttering. Then silence. The silence was total. No bombardment, no engine noise, no footsteps in the corridor above, no pneumatic hiss of cylinders descending through the tube system. Nothing. I sat at my desk in the silence and stared at the words I had just written. To yield is heresy. To retreat is to consent to the darkness. The wall does not ask whether those behind it deserve protection. The wall does not ask whether the enemy deserves to be opposed. The wall exists because withdrawal does not. The words were true. I could not deny their truth. The Imperial Fists did not yield. They did not retreat. They did not ask. They existed as the wall existed. Absolute. Unyielding. Permanent. And the wall held. It held at Variman's reach. It held at Hellwood 4. It held at Vouth and Maragast and 100 other sieges stretching back to the days of Rogal Dorn himself. The wall always held. But the wall was not built for the people behind it. The wall was built for the wall. The people were material. The doctrine was mortar. The faith was ferocrete. And when all the material had been consumed, the wall would still stand, a monument to its own existence, a fortress defending nothing except its refusal to fall. I did not question their faith. I had lived inside their faith for 3 months, and I had seen its architecture from the inside. Every load-bearing column, every compression joint, every angle of fire and prayer. The faith was real. The faith was strong. The faith was absolute. I questioned whether anything human could survive inside it. The answer was in the annex, in the racks of shattered armor, in the tags that bore the names of brothers who had been consumed, in the brass cylinders that contained the records of 26,000 lives expended and 4,700 lives preserved, in the catechism that I had copied 61 times, and would copy again tomorrow, and the day after that, until my hands could no longer hold the stylus. The answer was in the wall. The wall remembered. The wall endured. The wall held. And I was inside it. I picked up the stylus. I placed a fresh sheet of vellum on the desk. I aligned the edges with the desk's corners. I adjusted the glow strip's angle. I began to write. To yield is heresy. The words flowed. The mortar set. The wall rose letter by letter around the small and diminishing space in which I still existed. I would keep writing.